Hello and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Maud Rowell is a freelance journalist and writer from London. She went blind at 19 while traveling in South Korea. 2 months later, she went on to begin a 4-year degree in Japanese studies at University of Cambridge, including 1 year at Doshisha University in Kyoto. She trained in journalism at City, University of London, and over the course of the pandemic, wrote her first book, Blind Spot, Exploring and Educating on Blindness, published by 404 Inc. in November 2021. In the summer of 2021, she won the Holman Prize, run by San Francisco Lighthouse for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and received a grant to travel around Japan and write about her experiences. So, welcome, Maud.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy. It's a real pleasure to be here.
And thank you for visiting Shiraishi Island on your travels around Japan. This is amazing.
It's already such a highlight, so thank you for welcoming me to the island.
Good. And yes, Maud is right here with us today, so this is rather exciting. So I wanted to start out maybe talking a little bit about your experience in South Korea. Were you studying when you were there, or were you just traveling, and how did all this come about?
So I took a year out before starting university, and I worked in a school on an island in South Korea for 6 months. And after that, I was traveling around East Asia. I did Taiwan, I did Japan, and I did Korea again at the end. And just before flying home, I was spending some time in Seoul again. And I sort of realized that people's faces had become sort of invisible, or like something was kind of floating in between me and the person I was looking at, which I realized was probably not a good thing to be experiencing. So I went to hospital in the middle of the night by myself, and after a couple of days of tests, because it was all quite mysterious at the start, I was told I had a very rare degenerative eye disease that would eventually lead to blindness. And at that point, they told me that they probably weren't the best place to care for me, and I should go home to London, which has Moorfields Eye Hospital, which is quite a famous eye hospital and conveniently close to where I live, which worked out well. The eye disease I have is called familial exudative vitreoretinopathy. It's very rare and very hard to say, and it basically means that the blood vessels in my eye have the wrong information in them. So when they make more, they do that wrong, and fluid kind of leaks into the back of my eye. And because it's kind of fluid-based, this means that my vision is really changeable. I get a lot of floaters and kind of moving things, and it's very fluid. Yeah, and that is something that was interesting for me to experience, because I think, like many people, that isn't at all what I thought blindness was going to be like. I didn't really ever think about it very much, but I'm pretty sure that if you'd asked me before this happened to me what I thought blindness was, I would have said complete blackness. That's what most people tend to think it is. And it was, I'm going to say, interesting. Obviously, at the time, it was quite traumatic to find this out. But finding out that blindness is, in fact, a massive spectrum and encompasses a whole load of different ways of seeing was a very steep learning curve, but one that was really important to learn. And I'd now like to help other people understand that as well.
Well, I read your book, and it was absolutely fascinating, because as a sighted person who has never thought about a lot of these things, I learned so much from it. And because I think also it's written from a perspective of someone who was sighted and then lost some sight, it was also really good, because I felt that you could tread that line and know what people are thinking or not thinking a lot of times, and fill in the gaps there. So is there any way to categorize blindness? And the reason I ask is because at one point in your book, you had talked about an incident where a photo went viral on the internet because it was a blind person with a cane looking at their cell phone. And people just went berserk because they thought, oh my gosh, this person must be faking their blindness. And so I've heard there's peripheral blindness, there's probably all different kinds. So how can we help to categorize these things and try to understand why this person has a stick and this person, has a person leading them, or a dog, or, and all these different things?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to read my book, and I'm really happy you enjoyed it. But yeah, it's a really tricky thing because, as we've said, most people tend to think of blindness as one thing, when in fact it's a whole host of things, many, many multitudes of things. And that photo is really problematic because it really highlights that people think blind people have to fit a certain pattern. They have to see nothing and act as though they see nothing, or they're frauds and they're faking it. And this is really dangerous because the vast majority of people who are blind see something. The percentage is in the 90s. I think it's over 95. That is a real thing that I didn't just make up, even though I can't remember the exact number. Right. But it's a very, very high percentage of people who are legally blind who can still see something. So it's really problematic that people still kind of oscillate between, you see nothing, and then once they prove that they can see even the tiniest thing, that they're faking it, and there's no in between, right, when in fact the majority of people are in between. I, for example, still have peripheral vision, but it's the central vision where all the problems are for me, so I can't focus on anything. And so that, for me, means that I can't read things that are written down, I can't read writing, I can't see people's faces, I can't see detail, basically, but I can still see colour and shape and kind of the general impression of things, which makes quite a big difference, and does mean that I do quite often encounter people who kind of don't believe that I am blind or that I have any kind of issues because I've pointed out something to them which I can still perceive in a way that is different to how they would perceive it, but is still perceiving it visually. It's very tricky to narrow down what blindness actually is. I think in the book I also liken it to, I think a helpful way to think about blindness is to think of it kind of like how we might define literature, where we're not entirely sure how to narrow that down to one thing that it is, but we're pretty confident of the kind of things that it encompasses. And it's really important that we do start thinking of blindness as literally encompassing a wider range of things, because as that photo demonstrates, it's causing problems and people are being accused of being frauds. And it's really a lack of education, right?
Yeah, and awareness on everyone else's part.
Exactly. And if people just knew a little more about blindness and just like the absolute basics of what it is, things like that wouldn't happen. And it's really upsetting to be a blind person and constantly be accused of being a fake.
And you did mention what a lot of people do see. It's fascinating that it's probably completely different for each person.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really fascinating thing. Yeah, that everyone is seeing something different and no two people experiencing blindness will be completely alike, I would say. And I think that's brilliant. I think that's really amazing and really interesting. And I think, again, it's something we should really embrace, this idea that all ways of seeing are valid. They're all different, but they're all valid. And just because someone sees something in a different way to how you see it, it doesn't mean that their way of seeing the world, and I do mean seeing in this case, isn't just as important or as beautiful or as interesting as the way you see it.
It's just different.
Vision. Yeah, it's just different. And difference is what makes the world interesting.
That's right.
And we should embrace that.
Absolutely. I'm totally for that. And, living in Japan, everything, the culture is so different here from the Western cultures. And I try to tell people, it's not, our culture isn't better or worse. In Japan isn't better or worse. They're just different. And they both have their pros and cons and, good things, bad things. And isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to look at it. Yeah.
Another interesting part of your book was you're talking about traveling in Tokyo. So could you talk a little bit about that? Or not just Tokyo, I guess, all of Japan. But I think in the book you concentrated on Tokyo.
Yeah, so there's a section in the book where I'm talking about accessibility and different ways that cities have implemented systems that help blind people navigate. And Tokyo is an example I use because Tokyo is really, really excellent at using signals that aren't visual. There's basically a lot of noise happening in the Tokyo tube station, but it's all functional and it's all useful. And the thing that's brilliant about it is that it's useful for everyone and everyone can use it and access it, but it's specifically making an environment accessible for blind people. So things like you can hear running water near the toilets. There's birdsong to show you where the exits are. Each tube has like a different jingle for each station. So if you learn those, you can know where you are just by listening to those jingles, even if you don't speak Japanese and can't understand the announcements. And the reason that lots of these things were implemented was actually to kind of streamline the commuting process. When you've got a huge volume of people, you don't actually want every one of those people to be looking for signs. You want them to seamlessly move from where they are to where they want to be going. Using all the senses helps everyone streamline that process and helps the stations, all the people move more smoothly through these environments. So it really is helping everyone. And it's a great example of how accessibility, when it's done well, does help everyone and is for everyone. It's not just filling a kind of small niche with the disabled market.
That's a really good point, though, that other than language, sound is pretty much universal.
Yeah.
And then everyone can understand it. It's that damn language that causes the problems, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But I also do want to say that obviously I appreciate some people can't hear, and that's also fine. But the point is that when you use these systems in combination, you are essentially creating an environment that works for everyone. So the people who don't hear will use the visual cues, and the people who can't see will use the audio cues. Like, it's built to kind of fill in all the gaps for all kinds of people, and that's what's really great. That, you know, you can use all of these things together. You don't have to just pick one and stick with that. So that's why I use Tokyo as a really good example. And having been in Tokyo already this year in Japan, it was really exciting seeing all these things and using them myself, because the last time I was in Japan, I wasn't as blind as I am now. As I mentioned, it's degenerative, so changes over time. So yeah, that was a very interesting experience.
And another great example I remember from your book is you were talking about how someone was designing these art exhibits and they wanted the blind people to also be able to enjoy them. So they made like an audio headset so they could listen to the explanations of the exhibits. But in reality, what that is doing is that it's separating those people from those who can see the exhibit. And, you know, usually you're going with friends or family and you want to be able to interact together. So that was then changed to make it the audible for everyone in the group, so that as you approach the next exhibit, the audio would come on and everyone could enjoy the audio rather than just putting the person, you know, the blind person on their own with their own headset and separating them from the other people they were with. I thought that was really brilliant change.
So the project you're talking about was called the Oregon Project, and it was a collaboration with an artist called Keith Salmon, who lives in Scotland. I visited his studio, actually. He's lovely and his work is amazing, so please go and check it out. But between him and Microsoft, and essentially, they were trying to tackle the fact that a lot of kind of audio description for artwork does really put a blind person on their own. It's very kind of, it separates them off from everyone else, when in fact lots of blind people just want, you know, a universal experience that, as you say, when you're visiting a gallery with friends and family, you don't want to be on your own, shut off somewhere. You want to be with everyone experiencing it. And so the project, involved some quite high-tech sound things that basically are based on kind of the proximity of people to the artworks that Keith Salmon produced, would trigger certain sound effects. So as you moved around, the sound would move with you and play different tracks, and it was all very beautifully kind of strung together, and it sounds amazing. I'm quite sad I didn't get to experience it, as this was quite a few years ago and in the States. One of the pieces of feedback that Keith Salmon told me about that I think you're remembering as being really meaningful was a Microsoft employee who went to the exhibition with his guide dog and his family, and said that for the first time he was experiencing the same thing as his wife and daughter, and he wasn't just in his own little world with a headset that no one else could hear or access. And I thought that was really lovely.
That's great. Absolutely. And then this time you're in Japan, you went to Tohoku. And how was it traveling around in a non-city atmosphere where you might not have as many clues to help you get around?
Yes, that was quite tricky. And I'll be honest, Tohoku as a region, the infrastructure is not super if you don't drive. So there were kind of places where they were a city in name and maybe population size and density, but there'd be, you know, one train every 2-3 hours. And like, that's not a level of infrastructure I would expect in a city environment. It's not really great. And it did really make me wonder how disabled people who live in those regions kind of get about without having, you know, a friend who can drive, which isn't something you can expect of all disabled people, and isn't really fair to expect. That you should, you know, enable them to be independent. I think Japan is very interesting how it kind of oscillates between, you'll have some sections of some cities where there's loads of really great accessible things. You know, there's tactile paving everywhere. Like, that's really noticeable in Japan. They have a lot of tactile paving. Yeah, and that's really great. And then you also have great swathes of the country, and this is in cities as well, where there's no pavement. There's nothing. There's just the road, and then, like, in some cases, quite a deep gutter, and there are lampposts everywhere, because in Japan all the wiring is above ground, so there's a lot more telegraph poles. Mm-hmm. Yeah, things like that. Street furniture that's just sort of in the middle of the path that you might be following. And I do think it's interesting moving around and noticing that there's very little of the kind of middle ground that I might be used to in England, where I feel like the whole thing is middle ground, where there's some accessible things, but there's also gaps. Whereas Japan is like everything is covered or nothing is covered, and that is interesting experience.
So tell me now, I know you like to read books. How do you read?
So the main way I read now is with audio. When I first started going blind, I could magnify things, so I could have kind of Kindle books on the largest font setting, and that was fine. But as things kind of progressed, the font size doesn't go large enough anymore. And also it's really tiring to read with my eyes now. There's very, very poor stamina, and it's not as fun as it used to be. So now it is mainly audio. So that means audiobooks. I use Audible, which is a great service, and I am really enjoying that. I think these services are becoming more popular, so you're seeing more and more titles, and they're being done really well, which is really excellent, and I really, encourage that movement to keep going. And then I also have a device called the Orcam, which is essentially, it's about the size of a USB stick, and it clicks magnetically onto my glasses frame, and when you point at text, it will read it out loud to you. So
really?
That is a device.
What kind of cam is it?
It's called the Orcam, ORCAM. Orcam My Eye, as in MYEYE, but all one word. Yeah, I'm afraid I couldn't tell you much about the company, but the technology is amazing. It's honestly life-changing for me, because as a writer, someone who's always wanted to be a writer and who's always loved reading, losing access to print books was really, really upsetting. And there are lots of ebooks and audiobooks out there, but not as many as print books. And also, it's not the same experience. I think anyone will agree that, sitting with a paper book in your hands is not the same as sitting with headphones on and listening to it. It is just a different experience. And again, I'm not saying different as in worse or better. It's just different. And that was quite a transition that I had to adjust to. But the Orcam, meaning that I could still buy print books and then actually get something from them, was really, really meaningful. And I think it's amazing technology.
So the Orcam then, it will read that page to you?
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
It really is amazing. And it's surprisingly natural sounding. As in, I say that because I think anyone who's tried text-to-speech will know that often it's quite a...
Yeah,
it's
actually,
a very robotic, unlikable
way of reading. I tried the Kindle and I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible.
The Orcam is surprisingly good.
Okay.
Yeah, which is just really great.
Okay, and is there anything else that you would recommend?
There are lots of great assistive features that are built into things already, which I find are always the best way to go, because firstly, as I said, lots of things you have to buy on the side are really expensive. You and I have talked about Dragon dictation software. It's expensive. You have to buy it separately and then use it. But lots of companies will kind of have their own version of things that are built in. I'm afraid I can only really talk about Apple, which is what I use, but they have a really, really great system that you can use a voiceover on an iPhone, which is amazing. Shortcuts that can read out everything on your screen. Just 3-tap magnifying, just like really easy things that I use all the time and make so much difference to my life. I didn't have to pay anything extra for or install or go through all that faff. They're just there in my phone. Everyone can use them. And again, I think it's really important to remember that, yes, these things for me make the difference between not being able to use a phone and being able to use a phone. But for other people, they still have worth. Absolutely. There's a shortcut where you can like triple tap the back of your phone and it will bring up any app that you set that shortcut to. Like, that's useful for everyone.
Wow.
Everyone likes to streamline things. And accessibility tends to do that and encourage you to use other senses, which, is a helpful thing for everyone to embrace. So,
and how do you write? Like when you wrote this book, how did you go about doing that?
So, as again, we've discussed, the issue with dictation is that you have to go in afterwards and edit so much and so carefully that it's almost more work than just writing it by hand. So what I tend to do is I will write by hand, and I can't read what I've written, but I can still type by memory, and then I will use text-to-speech shortcuts to just have my computer read that back to me, and I will do as much editing as I can that way. Then I can magnify really, really large and edit that way, but obviously that's a bit more difficult, but usually I can catch most things by listening to it, so it's okay. But yeah, so it tends to be the writing experience itself is very similar to how it used to be. I'll just be tapping away on my keyboard with music playing. And then it's the having it read back to me constantly. So I always wear 2 sets of headphones. I have one that I can have music playing, so they'll be kind of in-ear headphones. And then I have the bone conduction headphones over the top that are connected to my computer that can play the text of what I'm writing.
Wow, I never would have considered having 2 sets of headphones.
Yeah, 2 sets
That's
of headphones
great.
are very useful because lots of blind people are having to listen to things that other people would use their eyes with. So I don't know. It's a nice way to kind of multitask oral tasks, to just have 2 sets of headphones doing different things.
Like, I've learned so much just by spending the past couple days, a bit of time with you. And one of the examples was I was wanting to show you something on my phone. And I was like, oh, look, here are some photos. And I turned my phone to you and I was like, oh, Amy, she probably can't see this, this photo is so small. And the great thing you did, which taught me so much, is you were like, can I take your phone and look at it? And then you could, bring it up to the level you needed to see it. And then you could, of course, make the photo larger yourself with your fingers. And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. Now I know what to do from now on. I can just hand something to someone, if they can see to a point, and say, here, and then they can make the adjustments and stuff. So are there little things like that that would be helpful for people like me who we want to do the right thing, yet I know there's a really fine line between someone who's helpful and someone who gets annoying.
Yeah.
So like, oh, you probably can't see this, and that's not very nice, right? So any things like that?
It's a really good question, and I get it a lot, if I'm honest. Because most people, they want to be nice and they want to be helpful, and they also, don't want to offend people, and I appreciate it is sometimes a tricky line to walk, and people are kind of worried to do the wrong thing. In terms of the example you've just given, I think it is really important to remember that someone who is blind will know better than you what they need to be able to access something. Yeah, in that case, I know that if I'm holding your phone and I can zoom in, then I can see at least bits of what you're trying to show me. And so it was helpful that then you responded to that by letting me do that and show you how best I can consume this content. You get this also a lot in terms of asking disabled people if they need help. If they say no, actually listen to that answer, because they will know what they need help with and what they don't. Also, in train stations and things, when station employees are kind of guiding you around, sometimes they just won't accept that I don't actually need to hold on to them physically and walk really slowly. Like, I can follow behind you. I'm listening to your footsteps. You're wearing a coloured uniform. Like, I can see where you are. So they will kind of insist that I hold on, and then we'll walk really slowly. And personally, I don't need that. And I'd like for them to listen when I say that I don't need that,
right,
and actually let me move through the station at a pace that I find more comfortable. And again, it's tricky because I do appreciate that they're trying to be helpful, but that, again, also sort of comes from the fact that they don't understand that blindness can mean more than just not seeing anything.
Reminds me of just being a non-Japanese person in Japan.
Yeah,
and
I think
people
there are
always
a lot
trying
of similarities.
trying to help you when you're like, well, actually, that's not what I need. And yes, I can speak Japanese. And yes, I can do this, but they can't judge because they have no idea.
Being a foreigner in Japan, also, you do encounter a lot of microaggressions, where I think anyone will agree that when you're in Japan and you don't look ethnically Japanese, you get a lot of, oh, where are you from? Oh, are you a tourist? And, some people aren't ethnically Japanese, but they were born here and have lived here all their lives. They're fluent in Japanese. You don't know by looking at someone what their background is. You can't know that. Assumption based on what you look like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of exhausting sometimes to encounter that kind of all the time. Like, every conversation will start with, oh, where are you from? How long are you here for? You're a tourist, right?
Or you're
I appreciate
American.
In this case I am a tourist, but that's not always the case. Yeah, and I think disability is fairly similar to that, and you do just get a lot of the same conversations over and over again.
But
it's
actually,
really
yeah, and you mentioned in your book too that actually this is a trope that is often seen in movies and such. So it's kind of no wonder people are have this lodged in their brain that this isn't,
No, indeed, it's a real myth that's being really perpetuated by pop culture. That's a classic twist in a film or a TV show or a book. The blind person wasn't blind all along, and that's how they did the thing or the murder or the magic trick. Yeah, and please stop. I think it is crazy that once I went blind myself, it was honestly like the people who had made that content had just forgotten that blind people were real, and they might see these things and kind of have hurt feelings, which is completely understandable. But Yeah, blind people are real, so please, if you're going to make content about us, maybe Google some things or talk to us or be vaguely informed.
Also, you brought up, again, getting back to reading, because we love to read. You brought up some famous people who are blind.
Yes, this was something I really wanted to emphasize in my book, that we tend not to learn about blind people in history in school or anything, but there are so many brilliant blind people from loads of different fields who I really think we should be learning about, because they really challenge the ideas that lots of us hold about blind people and about disability as a whole. Yeah, and as you noted at the beginning, like, my perspective is very much shaped by the fact that I wasn't blind or disabled for the first 19 years of my life, and then I kind of transitioned into it, and that transition is still happening. And for me personally, that's been a really, really interesting perspective to have, because I can remember how I felt about disability, and it makes me very sad now, but there were so many toxic narratives that I'd internalized, and then having to become disabled and encounter those narratives in myself that were now kind of about myself. It would have really helped if I'd had some blind role models to turn to, and there's no reason we shouldn't be learning about these people when we're younger. So the most prolific mathematician of all time, Leonard Euler, he went blind and then became even more prolific. He was amazing. But yeah, the function sign that we learn in maths at school, pi to symbolize pi, he came up with both of those. James Holman is always my favorite and my go-to. He was an incredible, incredible person in history. My absolute dream dinner party guest from history when I get that question. So he was born in the Georgian period. He joined the Navy and then went blind completely out of nowhere in his early 20s. And then he went on to circumnavigate the globe. He trained as a doctor. He wrote books. He was just the most incredible figure. Everything I read about him just blows my mind a tiny bit. He was so cool. But my favourite fact about him is that when he went to Australia, his beard was so awesome that people who couldn't grow their own beards to emulate him would strap wombat tails to their faces to be more like James Holman, which is just brilliant.
That's great.
Yeah, he was very cool. But yeah, there are loads of examples, and I do highlight a few in my book, so if you're interested, please do read it and find out.
And then just one more thing, I again, getting back to not wanting to offend people, and of course, all of us non-Japanese living in Japan are very aware of this all the time, because it's so easy to, offend someone or not be polite or whatever. So we're all kind of hyper-conscious. But when it gets to political correctness and blindness, what are some of the vocabulary we should be using, or vocabulary we should be ditching? Or like even this conversation, I wasn't sure if I should be using the word blind, or is it, sighted or sightless or whatever. So could you go over just a few things that we should be aware of?
Yeah, again, this is one I get quite a lot, and I think people are quite scared to use the word blind in particular because it sounds so, and we have so many there's so much baggage surrounding it, and people are quite afraid to use it. Personally, I would rather people just said blind, and when people are uncomfortable about it, it draws so much more attention to it and makes it seem like so much more of a big deal when actually, I'm blind, it's fine, you don't need to be afraid of it. It kind of feels like Voldemort, like the he who must not be named. Like you can say the name, you give it more power when you don't say it. So yeah, saying the word blind is definitely not offensive, can confirm that.
Good.
I think the tricky part comes in that, anyone who is blind can identify with any term that they feel comfortable with, and that's fine. And maybe the best thing to do is just ask them what they would like to say. Personally, I use blind because for me, terms like visually impaired, partially sighted, they just sound really kind of clinical, and I think blindness better encompasses that it's not just a medical condition I have, it's a whole perspective. It comes with so many other things that are more than just, like having an eye disease. So personally, I prefer blind because it's, it comes with so much more cultural meaning as well.
And it's such a traditional word. You think, it must not be in vogue anymore.
Yes,
there has to be a better word.
Exactly, yeah. I know exactly what you mean. It does feel like, they must have a better politically correct version of this now. It's like, no, they don't. Blind is fine.
And of course, it's a chance for us all to realize that, like you said, the spectrum is just very large, and There's so many different things within it that it can be. And that's even more important, I think.
Absolutely.
Than categorizing.
I think if you are worried about saying blind, visually impaired is probably your best bet. That one's definitely, it's on all the forms. That's okay.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
And then lastly, on the podcast, I always like to ask our guests what their favorite books are.
And I was wondering if I could give you my 3 favorite works of travel writing.
Absolutely. This is going to be great. And you're such the traveler. And your hero is James Holman. So this is going to be, you're an expert here. So I think this is going to be very interesting to find out.
I've got to say, I came to travel writing quite late over lockdown when I couldn't physically travel. I decided to let my mind do the traveling with reading travel writing. But no, it's a brilliant genre. There are so many great examples out there. But I would have to say my top 3 would be, in reverse order, I'm going to go for Bruce Chatwin, the number 3, The Song Lines, I think, or In Patagonia. Can those 2 tie for 3? Sorry.
Absolutely.
But yeah, Bruce Chatwin he was a terrific writer. I haven't been to either Australia or Patagonia, which is what those 2 books are about. I always find it fascinating reading about places I don't know very much about. So those would be number 3. Number 2, I'm going to go for Twilight in Italy by D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence is a terrific travel writer. I think lots of people maybe don't associate him so much with travel writing,
right?
But his use of language is just exquisite, and it makes me quite sad because I know with every sentence I read, I'm so I will never write anything as good as this sentence. But it does make for beautiful, beautiful reading. Yes, Twilight in Italy is just really stunning. And for number 1, my favourite piece of travel writing that I've read so far is The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd. It's about the Cairngorms in Scotland. I recently wrote an article about this book and why I love it so much.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and just...
Where can we read that?
It's on the Creative Scotland website. Oh, if I'm allowed to plug myself a tiny bit. While I'm traveling around Japan, I'm using an Instagram account called Where Birds Won't Go, which is based on a translation of a Japanese expression meaning remote or off the beaten track. Tori mo kayoanu.
Would it qualify here on Shiraishi Island?
I hope so. Yeah. But while I'm using that account, the link in my profile bio is to the article that I'm talking about now.
Oh,
about
great.
Nan Shepherd.
Great.
Yeah, so if people are on Instagram, you can find it quite easily there. But no, it's a brilliant, brilliant book. She writes with such passion and just beautiful language again. And I think it's quite different from lots of travel writing in that it's not a place that she, visited and then wrote about. It's somewhere she's loved all her life, and you really feel that. It's a real love letter to the region. And I think it's wonderful to see someone filled with so much love for a place that they've known for so long. Because I think lots of people, if something is usual to you,
right,
it kind of loses that magic.
Yeah,
in some cases,
sure.
Not for everyone. But I think, she writes with such childlike wonder about somewhere she's known so long, and I think that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on the Books on Asia podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a nice time.
It has. It's been really great getting to know you. Thank you so much, Maud.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.